I'm Debbie Harwell. I'm the managing editor of the Houston History Magazine, which is published by the Wellcome Wilson Houston History Collaborative at the University of Houston in the Center for Public History. As many of you know, activism has a lot of faces and many unsung heroes. We frequently think about protesting when we talk about activism, but it can also be voting with your feet. It can be working for political causes or behind the scenes. It can be expressing yourself in art or caring for an endangered or injured animal. Sorry, Lindsay. Or it could be giving your time and money to causes that you believe in and want to support. Our panel is going to demonstrate 4 different types of activism in 4 different eras of Houston. But what they share is one component, and that is a desire on the behalf of the actors to make Houston a better place for all of us. In 2009, I got involved with an oral history project to document the stories of the 3rd Ward, and in particular, the Yates class of 1958. Some of you may want to know, well, why the Yates class of '58? Well, it was the last class to graduate under the direction of Professor William Holland. And it was the last one in its original building before they moved to what is the new building, which opened in later that year. William Holland came to Houston from Terre Haute, Indiana in 1927. He excelled in sports, track, and baseball, so that's where he got the name Babe. And he was hired by HISD to be the coach at Yates. He was later promoted to assistant principal, and in 1941 became the school's principal. But Holland wasn't just a principal. He was an advocate. He was an activist, and he set the tone for the school and the community. It was a different 3rd Ward than what we think of today. At that time, it was a thriving economic and cultural center for Black life. Yates opened in 1926. It was the 2nd high school for African Americans here in Houston, and it was a community anchor where many community events were held. Everybody knew everybody in the neighborhood, and teachers knew their students personally. Oftentimes, they might have been neighbors. The teachers may have taught their students' parents, in fact. And something that's really a foreign concept for us today, a lot of the times, the students went to their teachers' houses and cleaned them on the weekends, which would be kind of a nice bonus, I think, as a teacher today. And parents were happy to see this. They were very invested in education, and they were glad to see that people cared about their students. So, as I said, we started out with this oral history project from the Yates class of '58. So I'd like to introduce you to a few of those people. This is Dolores Johnson. When she came here from Louisiana, she spoke with what she called a very heavy Geechee dialect. But there weren't any speech therapists for her at that time, so she went to Hampton University and became one. She worked her way up in HISD, and she was appointed by Governor Ann Richards as the first African-American member of the State Board of Examiners for Speech and Language Pathology. I want to let her tell you a little bit about what she thought of William Holland. Come on.
I was at Yates. I had very, very interesting teachers and a miraculous principal who was Professor William S. Holland. He was a man of great courage, of great responsibility, and he just led his students to perfection. He told us we had to be the best that we could be because there was going to become a time when integration was going to come and we were going to have to be able to fit in and we were going to have to be able to work in the work world. So now we had to do the best we could so we could compete. We were always competing.
So for William Holland and his students, nothing short of excellence was going to be acceptable. But the lessons didn't stop with just what you were doing personally. Holland taught his students to understand where they fit, what their role was in the larger community, and to fight for more. For example, at that time we had one amusement park, Playland Park in town. It was down on South Main. But African American children couldn't, or families or anyone, couldn't go there except on Juneteenth. So Holland encouraged them not to attend on Juneteenth, because why should you go and spend your money at a place that you couldn't attend or be invested in all year long? The same was true for businesses. Don't shop where you can't try on the clothes and that sort of thing. But Holland also fought the district for the best for his students. He fought against marching at the back of the parades, particularly something like the rodeo parade where they were dodging the horse poop all along the trail. He fought for textbooks that weren't worn out from years of use by white schools. He fought for new facilities, particularly as the school became more and more overcrowded after the World War II era, when we had a large influx of people coming to Houston for jobs. If they were going to be separate, then William Holland was certainly going to demand that they were going to be equal. Judge Robert Anderson started the first African American law firm in Houston. He briefly moved to New Jersey during his high school years, so his interview offered an interesting comparison between the Northern high school experience and the experience at Yates. And he said he would have gladly taken the experience at Yates because of the caring nature of the whole community, the whole school community, and what it meant to them as students. Failure, he said, was never an option. History paints pictures. Historians paint pictures in a lot of ways, almost like artists themselves do. Up until about 2 years ago, we had a high school stadium, or it was originally a high school stadium that stood right over here in between us and TSU, or in between us and Yates. It was built in the 1940s as a WPA project. It was Houston High School Stadium. And I want you to visualize this through the Yates class of 1958's eyes. It's Thanksgiving Day. It's the Turkey Day game. It is Yates playing its biggest rival, which is Wheatley from the 5th Ward. People have enjoyed their holiday meal, and about 30,000 people are making their way to that stadium for a high school game. A high school game. For the people in the 3rd Ward, they are coming out of their houses, they're walking there to the stadium to go to that game. And everybody, regardless of what school you're for, is dressed in their finest attire because this is the event of the year. And they're showing up there for that game. They're taking part in a very fundamental community activity. But this is another place where William Holland, along with the principal from Wheatley, had to fight for what was due. Because even though HISD was raking in the cash for all the people who were filling those seats over there at the stadium, they weren't getting their fair share of the funds. They weren't getting the same percentage as white schools. So they said, well, we're not going to play this game anymore if you're not going to be fair to us. And eventually there were some changes. But Holland would have to pay a price for his activism. The Reverend Donald Dixon was one of the people that played in the Turkey Day game. He was the first African American head coach in a white Houston school. He's proud of that, but what he's most proud of is playing in that Turkey Day game and the championship ring that you see there on his right hand. So I want to let him tell you a little bit about what happened to William Holland for speaking up for his students.
They brought a principal from our rivalry school Wheatley Senior, Phyllis Wheatley Senior, which was a slap in the face to our school, to our community, and especially to the things that he had worked so hard to get. It killed the school spirit. And they knew what they were doing from downtown. They knew exactly what they were doing. And their premise was to really show him that next time maybe you'll keep your mouth shut.
So in exchange for being an advocate and an activist for his students, William Holland was essentially demoted. When they opened the new school, he remained in the old building, which became Ryan Middle School. His outspokenness made him a hero to his students and people in the community. About 3,600 people signed a petition on his behalf. 2 white school board members actually voted against the change, but it went through anyway. But maybe William Holland got the last laugh, and that's kind of how I like to think about it, because later that year, Houston elected its first African-American member to the school board, Hattie Mae White. William Holland retired in 1974. At that time, he was the longest tenured principal in HISD history. He had been with the school district 47 years, and 33 of them as a principal. He became a school board member, and later, they named a middle school after him. This is him at the groundbreaking. He's the second one over there with the shovel. But as is often the case when we name schools after people, it's a great honor when it happens, but a few years later, nobody really remembers who that name is or why that person was significant. William Holland died in 1981, but his students have passed on his legacy by teaching their children and their children's children his ideals and his lessons. They have lived their life knowing that they don't have to take a back seat to anybody. He was an activist, he was an advocate, and he was the mighty lion at Yates High School.
The grassroots style of Maria Jimenez's activism mirrors the efforts of animal activists that are in the trenches on Houston streets on a daily basis. But our current vision of animal rescue looks much different than it did during our city's earlier years. I will briefly discuss the evolution of Houstonians' interaction with companion animals and the rise of our vibrant and active rescue community today. Over the last century, Houston's animal activists have been working diligently to better the lives and treatment of our city's pets and strays. In Houston's early days, animals were used as a source of work. Beyond the traditional farm and ranch animals, it wasn't uncommon to use the neighborhood's stray dog to pull a wagon or cart. When the job was done, the dog was released back to the street. If a stray became a nuisance for citizens, the city pound would take care of it. In the 19th century, taking care of it usually meant drowning or beating the animal to death. This treatment, along with the poor treatment of horses in New York City, inspired Henry Bergh in 1866 to found the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the country's first animal welfare organization. Public response to this new group was mixed, and the movement was slow to grow all the way here to Texas. But some Houstonians were becoming more intrigued with the ideals of the Victorian era, including the desire to connect with nature. Owning a pet fed this desire, but it also helped one stand out in another way. Having a dog or a cat was a sign of social standing. It told others that you and your family could afford to take in and care for an animal. Slowly, people's perception of the value of a companion pet was changing. By the early 20th century, the focus gradually moved away from automatic and brutal death under the animal control format and morphed into the goal of animal sheltering. That is, bringing an animal into a shelter with the hope of finding them a home. Houston's animal activists were looking at ways to save lives and reduce suffering. One of the citizens actively working to help Houston's animals was Julia Idison. Known, of course, as Houston's beloved librarian, Idison also served on the board for the Houston SPCA, founded in 1924. She was an animal lover herself, and the Houston Metropolitan Research Center holds a number of wonderful photos of Idison with a variety of pets, including here on the left. The Houston SPCA was the first private animal shelter in Houston. They housed animals at their building at 216 North Jackson Hill Street near Memorial Drive in what we would today call the Washington area. They later had a location in the East End at 69th and Clinton Drive and are currently located on Old Katy Road. As the only private shelter in the area until the Houston Humane Society was founded 32 years later, the Houston SPCA worked to educate the public on proper pet ownership and animal care. One element of proper pet ownership that began to be promoted by mid-century was spaying or neutering your pet. Not yet a movement to reduce pet population, proponents of spaying and neutering advertised it as a convenience to the owner, something that would help reduce wandering since many pets were allowed to roam freely. In the 1960s and 70s, however, the reality of the animal overpopulation across the country became mightily apparent as shelters filled to the brim and the animals' living conditions deteriorated. While animal advocates had been campaigning for more humane euthanasia techniques such as gas chambers, which incidentally were deemed inhumane and banned in Texas in June of 2013, state law required, and still requires to this day, that a stray animal be kept for 3 days before being euthanized. That meant the shelters were simply out of room. In response, spay and neuter initiatives in an effort to reduce the number of unwanted animals became a cornerstone of the animal activists' work. But the benefits of these initiatives take time. On August 4th, 1972, KHOU TV reported on the conditions of the city pound and the furor elicited by animal activists in response. The video goes on to show dirty cages stuffed with 12 animals or more in each. A new facility was under construction, and a pound representative assured the reporter that conditions would improve. A group of shelter volunteers, however, could no longer sit back while the conditions at the shelter remained deplorable. The group broke away and established Citizens for Animal Protection, CAP for short, currently has a shelter and adoption center on the Katy Freeway. The activists with CAP pioneered programs for pet adoption, pet therapy for veterans and the elderly, and feral cat programs. It is important to note the difference between municipal shelters, such as Harris County's veterinary public health facility and Houston City Shelter called BARC today, and private shelters like the Houston SPCA and CAP. The municipal shelters are required to take in all animals that come to their doors without exception. They continue to serve the community as animal control as well as animal shelter. Private shelters, on the other hand, can close intake or choose to take only a certain size or breed of animal and not another. Killing animals to make space for more is sadly a regular occurrence at the municipal shelters, but it also happens consistently and has happened consistently over the years at Houston's private shelters. A study conducted by the Mayor's Task Force in 2005 revealed that Houston's 5 major shelters, 2 municipal and 3 private, kill a total of 200 animals per day, 365 days a year. This dramatic number of animals euthanized in Houston's shelters prompted many new activists to join the cause. In the 1990s, a movement away from shelter killing gained popularity. The no-kill movement suggested that no longer should animal activists ask how they could make euthanasia more humane, but instead ask why killing was necessary at all. While pondering these larger issues, however, animal activists in Houston had to deal with immediate needs and emergencies. When Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast in 2005, Houston's animal advocates jumped into action. Even before the storm hit, the Houston SPCA began receiving animals from the Louisiana SPCA. After evacuations brought many New Orleans residents and their pets to Houston, a makeshift animal shelter was set up in the Astrodome. Houston area rescue groups also partnered with Louisiana groups to move pets into temporary and long-term foster homes. Today, Houston boasts an amazing number of rescue groups. Because rescue groups do not euthanize like the larger shelters, they are extremely tight on intake, and most in the area are always full. But some rescue groups have focused on outside-of-the-box solutions and have incorporated, in addition to the spay and neuter initiatives, programs for transporting animals out of the state, like Rescued Pets Movement, supporting TNR for feral cat colonies to trap, neuter, and return neighborhood cats, like Friends for Life does, or organizing street feeding teams that feed strays and attempt to keep them safe until a foster or adopter can be found, as Barrio Dogs does. Others, like Unity for a Solution, seek to bring together people from various rescues to help educate people on proper pet ownership, similar to what Julia Idison and the Young Houston SPCA worked to do so many years ago. Animal activists in Houston have a number of things already working against them, including a climate that allows for multiple breeding seasons, an estimated 600,000 to, at the most, 1.2 million strays on our streets, opposing beliefs between different rescuers, intense emotions, and strong-willed activists. But they are making a difference, one animal at a time, out on Houston's streets.
In the late 50s, schools designated for minority groups were places where discrimination could flourish. But one school's treatment of a girl named Maria Jimenez changed the trajectory of her life completely. Maria Jimenez is activism personified. Her life's work revolves around social justice and got its start at the University of Houston, where the Chicano movement was fueled by young Latinos who faced relentless discrimination. She migrated in 1957 with her family, coming from Coahuila, Mexico, and settling in Magnolia Park. It was a day Maria's mother never let her or her siblings forget. Beginning in grade school, she was forced to assimilate into an entirely new society with different rules and expectations. The society expected her to abandon her native culture and to accept herself as a second-class citizen. She was prohibited from speaking Spanish in school and often couldn't understand, and fell victim to taunts and teases when she showed any evidence of being Mexican. But her parents wanted her at a predominantly Anglo school, knowing that immersion was the best way to learn English. At home, she spoke only Spanish, and her family retained their close ties to Mexico and often visited. Her upbringing was traditional and family-oriented, and Maria had strong feminist influences in her life. Her grandmother emphasized that women's roles were not only domestic ones and made sure that Maria understood that domestic work was hard work. Her father pushed for his children's education and was often asked why. Why would you educate the girls? He knew that a college degree would prevent Maria and her sisters from being trapped in unhappy marriages if they ever found themselves in one, and he wanted them to have options. As a young lady, Maria showed an interest in debate and public speaking. Her parents bent their usually strict rules about long-distance trips and money spending to allow Maria to compete. In her competitions, Maria faced discrimination from judges and missed scholarship opportunities for being Mexican. Maria clearly remembers one judge saying, "How could we let this Mexican girl win?" Her presentations were always political, centering on feminism or Mexican-American discriminations. Although she was discouraged by her academic counselors, Maria was admitted to the University of Houston and began studying political science. Maria's first impressions of the University of Houston were isolating. The Latino presence on campus was around 400 of 29,000 students. Determined to make her voice heard, Maria sought a political student organization. And she first joined the Young Democrats and worked with Cesar Chavez in organizing the lettuce boycotts in Houston. In time, Maria grew dissatisfied with the Young Democrats, citing the organization's occupation with electoral politics and not issues specific to Mexican Americans. Eventually, the Mexican American Youth Organization, or MAYO, was formed through the leadership of another organization, the League of Mexican American Students, or LOMAS. Unlike LOMAS, which focused on more social activities, MAYO was characterized by radical politics and confrontational, aggressive tactics. MAYO collaborated with the Black Student Union and the UH feminist groups, who were known for staging radical demonstrations. Maria found common ground with the feminists and focused on female-specific issues, even though she faced criticism from her peers, her fellow Chicanos. There was a clash between the young women, like Maria, who identified with both the feminist and Chicano movements, and were Chicanos who believed it was impossible to be faithful to both movements, and Maria was often interrogated by her peers for betraying the culture. Her work with the farm workers gave Maria an inclusive perspective. And the farm worker fight overlapped with the Mexican-American issues, but also extended into larger conversations of economic and social stratification. She said, "By the time I graduated from the university, it was very clear in my mind that the movement was not just an issue of discrimination, but of social inequities." And here is a video of Maria from a UH Memories interview with Samantha Rodriguez saying a few words about her experience.
I think it was my involvement really with the lettuce boycott that always gave me, and the fact that I was a Mexican immigrant, as opposed to many of my colleagues who were second or third generation Mexican Americans. I had a very distinct identity, and also the farm worker fight was like a broader fight, because with the farm workers, you dealt with economic inequality, and you dealt with union organizing, and then how the capitalist system worked in terms of the struggle of the farm workers against the agribusinesses, and who the agribusinesses were and their connection to government. So that experience, I think, helped me always to have a broader perspective of the Chicano movement as sort of a step toward equality, but not necessarily the end in itself.
After graduation, Maria returned to Mexico to continue her fight for equality. She spent time with the Mayans in the Yucatan, and for the first time, Maria knew how it felt to be part of a powerful majority group, being Mexican, in Mexico. Her time in southern Mexico exposed Maria to the Yucatan's other minority groups, Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Guatemalans, and her experiences prepared her for her eventual return to the United States, where those three same groups were growing minority populations. When she left the United States, there were few Central Americans, and she came back. Her first jobs were with the Central American communities and with the Service Employees International Union. Her next work was through the Immigrant Law Enforcement Monitoring Project of the American Friends Service Committee, documenting abuses of authority and forming coalitions to work on documentation systems in border areas. The recommendations she worked on during her second report became adapted into Section 503 of the 1990 Immigration Law and developed clear policy on the use of deadly force by the Border Patrol. In 1986, the Immigration Control and Reform Act included provisions to legalize resident and documented immigrants who could prove they had lived continuously in the United States and had entered the country before January 1st, 1981. Work visas promising the same security as a permanent residency were offered to immigrants who could provide proof, but were unfair and unrealistic for migrants who were forced to cross the border regularly and hide from the government because they lacked documentation. The Immigration Control and Reform Act resulted in 400,000 immigrants nationwide becoming undocumented in one day. It was followed by lawsuits and a temporary residence given and then revoked again in 1996. But after noticing a violation of the 1986 law on one man's deportation order, Maria organized a meeting of 300 people, all enraged by the revocation. Maria promised to help them organize and get a law through Congress, and towards the end of the meeting, they had founded ARCA, the Association for Residency and Citizenship of America. Within weeks, they were 1,000 members strong, raising money and awareness. Maria trained members and formed new nationwide branches over the course of 3 years. In the end, ARCA members fought for and earned their citizenship and remained politically active. Maria credits their long-lasting involvement because of the struggle they had to endure for their permanent residency. As an organizer, Maria learned about multilingual communication. As ARCA grew throughout the nation, the organization also grew more diverse. The San Jose branch, composed mostly of Sikhs from India, was one of the larger and more active branches and frequently worked alongside the predominantly Latino Houston base. Both groups had the same goals as immigrants, but they weren't without their cultural boundaries. Maria learned the importance of an interpreter's presence and noted the immigrant participants would often begin to leave if they couldn't understand the meetings. Often there would be 2 meetings, one in Spanish and then followed by one in Punjabi. There were different customs between the groups, from handshaking to family participation. Political alignments were touchy. Mexican immigrants agreed upon issues like the need to speak Spanish as a right or the right to an education, but they wouldn't touch upon their Castro positions. Maria asks, how can you establish your presence and petition the government and apply pressure without being able to vote? This is the problem faced by many of the immigrants she works with. Political activity is not defined exclusively by elections, and Maria used this to her and the immigrants' advantage. Emphasizing the grassroots allowed for groups to march separately and hit together, and for an emphasis on the importance of daily politics, of meetings and communication. For minority communities, communication and daily politics is important because otherwise it is easy for populations to become isolated. Maria believes daily political participation is where the anti-immigrant movement has an advantage and more experience. Through her work, Maria helped immigrants establish their own authentic American identities like she did her own. She identifies herself as Mexica, Chicana, Gringa, and a U.S. citizen. Like all immigrants, Maria shares an experience of dual identity and helped others craft their own. She taught them to organize and to be able to do so on their own schedules and conditions. She tells other organizers, "You speak for the people affected. I can't do that. It's very easy for me to go into the Rio Grande Valley and scream about the Border Patrol abusing somebody, but I don't live in the valley and I don't have to live with Border Patrol." For Maria, it was not enough to change legislation, but to show people how to do it themselves.
As Houston's animal rights activists have worked in Houston streets to save 1 animal at a time, as have Houston's artists working in the streets painting 1 mural at a time. Hi everybody, my name is Nimra Haroon and I'm an intern at Houston History, and I'm going to be talking to you about the history of Houston's graffiti culture. Although graffiti has been around for thousands of years from the time of hieroglyphics, we're going to be discussing modern graffiti, which dates back to the 1960s out of Brooklyn, New York, with the rise of the hip-hop movement. And the hip-hop movement stemmed from the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, and so graffiti has just been a component of that. The hip-hop movement was an underground culture, and it was comprised of 4 elements. You had your breakdancing, you had your DJing and turntabling, you had your rap music, and you had graffiti, which was its final element, and it was essentially the written language of hip-hop. Back then, it was one culture. They weren't individualistic, so you couldn't have rap music unless it had a CD cover that had graffiti on it. It was all part of one culture, and essentially when rap music became commercialized and marketers started using it in forms of commercials, that's when the hip-hop culture broke apart and each element went its own way. And so graffiti soon followed after that, and it was introduced as Microsoft fonts, and it appeared on album covers, and you saw it in advertisements, and that's not what its original purpose was. Its original purpose was to be a part of the hip-hop movement. You're going to learn a little bit about an artist, Gonzo247, who said to me that rap was the CNN of the ghetto. That's how people learned about larger social issues. The urban animals were known for their quirky habits. In 1979, Eddie Scott and Scott Prescott formed a group that was known for their bar hopping, crosstown skating, roller hockey, and graffiti art. They were lawyers, electricians, dancers, bartenders, artists, and even a Harris County deputy. They were known for their charitable efforts in the community, so even though they were rebellious, they did a lot of work for the community, and one way was through graffiti. George Hickson was an art car photographer back in the early 80s, and he once said that the urban animals were a wild and fascinating collection of artists and other art-inclined people. So although they were doing other activities, they were very well known for their graffiti and the messages they were spreading through graffiti. Aerosol warfare was founded in 1989, but it was founded as something differently back then as it is today. So in 1989, Houstonian graffiti artist Gonzo247 and Merge 360 began documenting their activities, illegal and legal. And they established a pen pal system with graffiti artists around the US, and they were collecting videos and exchanging videos of them painting. So what Gonzo did is he started compiling these VHS tapes together, and he created a video magazine, and this was called Aerosol Warfare. It was sold worldwide, and Gonzo understood that graffiti was part of the hip-hop movement, so this magazine was covering other aspects of the hip-hop culture. He became very attached to graffiti, and then eventually he started just to hone in onto that. He also established a legal spot at the intersection of Palmer and McKinney Street in Houston, a legal spot for people to come and spray paint, and it's still there today. In 1994, Christian Azul, Christopher Carl, and Gonzo established Aerosol Warfare as it is today, and it serves as an urban art workspace, a gallery, a Mecca exhibition. They have workshops for students to discuss street art, urban art, and graffiti art. A little bit about Gonzo. His real name is Mario Enrique Figueroa Jr., and he began his graffiti career in 1980s, around 1984. He was one of the first pioneers of Houston's graffiti culture, as he produced the video magazine in the 90s, and then he established Wall of Fame, and then he founded Aerosol Warfare Gallery in 2000. And so although he started as a traditional street artist, then he feels as though he's evolved, and he paints on other mediums, such as automobiles, skateboards, helmets, plexiglass, clothes. You name the material, he's probably painted on it. He likes to try new techniques, new media, and you're going to hear a little bit about him.
A little cliche or cheesy, but every mural I've ever painted has been my favorite. I mean, it's my favorite until I do the next one. Then, oh man, that's my favorite. And you know, it's really hard to pinpoint one or the other as being better or more impressive, because as I grow as an artist, the level of the quality level and my, just everything, as I mature and evolve, so does my art.
Right.
And so, something I paint today there's no way it can compare with something I painted in the 80s. However, something I painted in the 80s, for me at that moment, was probably the greatest thing ever, and I had to get through that phase to get to where I'm at now.
That was me in the back saying right. The picture on the left is him in 1991, and this is a freight car that he was painting, and he really likes this picture, so I included it in this presentation. The picture above that, as you can see, it's a necklace of spray can tips. And he's been collecting the tip of every paint of can that he uses since the 80s. And he created this necklace series, which he's copyrighted, and he calls My Life Around My Neck. And he wears a necklace every single day, and he sees this series as being representative of his aerosol journey. He calls it his own personal diary. And no tip is the same, because each spray can tip has its own story, its own journey, its own colors, its own layers, and he has a very strong attachment to these necklaces. Daniel Angelou immigrated from Mexico at the age of 14, and he came to the U.S., specifically Houston. He came in Houston, and I'm sure many of you have seen a mural that looks something like this on some road in Houston. And so his murals are very iconic. They're made of intricate shapes and political messages, and he likes to be an activist whenever he paints, and we're going to hear a little bit from him.
The only way I know how to approach anything is through an activist mind. I don't have the artist mind, you know. And when someone offers me something, or they're like, hey, you want to do this, I think more like progressive. Like, okay, cool. What can this do? How is this beneficial? How is this going to do something? How is this going to? Right. How? You know.
So, as you heard, he said, the only way I know how to approach anything is through the activist mind. I don't have an artist mind. When someone offers me something, I think more progressive, like, okay, cool, what can this do? How is this beneficial? Anytime he's offered a mural to paint, he thinks, how is this beneficial for the community? What's the message that this is going to spread? What's the impact that this is going to have on the businesses that are surrounding this building? And so Daniel is very much an activist. He's painted for dozens of places across the U.S. and across the world. He's invited to art exhibitions all the time. He's painted for the Mexican Consulate, the Texas Art Asylum, Houston Metro. Many places really idolize his work. So whenever you put these artists on a bigger platform, more and more people see graffiti and attach a market value to it. So eventually it broke its way from being on subways and bus stops to making its way into the galleries. Well, there was some kind of transition that happened in between there, and that's that market value and that price tag that got attached to it. So now you have commissioned street art. And so these artists were recognized, and people were saying, hey, these people can get paid for the work they're doing, and they're very worthy of the work that they're doing. And the community started demanding it. The art buying community valued it, started buying it, and so you had businesses commissioning artists to come and paint for them. And so whenever you have legal walls appear, you have the quality of the work going up, because then the artist has time to complete the piece of art, and rather than having 5 hours at nighttime when they're doing it illegally, they have 5 days, and thus the quality of the work goes up, and more people appreciate it. So this created a domino effect, and more artists have received spotlight and attention and have been commissioned to work throughout the city of Houston. And a lot of these murals that are being painted are these activism type murals where they're promoting these positive messages. So really quickly, we're going to run through the 3 that you see on here. Many of you may have been in the public garage of the the parking garage of the Houston Public Library, and the very left photo shows aerosol warfare that was at work. In October of 2011, they were commissioned by the Houston Public Library to paint this mural called Linking You to the World. And if you go in the parking garage, you see that there's faces of different cultures, people of different cultures, and messages from different cultures. And it's a very uplifting mural. The one in the center is very iconic. You may have seen it at Market Square or at Bush Airport, which is testing. Okay. Bush Airport. International visitors see this center mural the first thing when they land at George Bush Intercontinental Airport. And Gonzo 247 was commissioned by the City of Houston and the Greater Houston Conventions and Visitors Bureau to paint this as part of their marketing campaign, which was called Houston is Inspired. The one on the very left is time from Green Street, and you may know Green Street is in downtown Houston. It's comprised of shops and restaurants. And in spring of 2013, the Houston Arts Alliance and also Greater Houston Convention and Visitors Bureau commissioned 4 artists to paint these 4 words: tasty, hip, funky, and inspired, once again promoting Houston's positive image, Houston's positive, eclectic diversity. Art has also made its way in the community. Like mentioned before, Aerosol Warfare has urban art workshops, and another place that has opened its doors to the community is the Kings Point Mullet. You may not know this, but the Kings Point Mullet is located next to Alameda Mall, and at 17,000 square feet, it's the largest graffiti art space in the state of Texas, and no one knows a word about it. It houses overhouse art supply, and every inch of the space is covered in paint. And people from around the world fly in to come paint here because it's free and they don't have to worry about getting arrested. They practice quotes, they practice messages, they practice how am I going to write something and take it back to my community and make a difference. And so Skis 181 and Jonathan Estes, who was a former Angleton runaway, Jonathan Estes grew up in Montrose and founded the Kings Point Mullet. They created this gallery, which used to be a warehouse several decades ago by Alameda Mall. And the name is a reference to the mullet, which is business in the front, party in the back. So at the Kings Point Mullet, the art supply store is in the front, which is the business, and the party in the back is where the graffiti goes on. Unfortunately, Jonathan Estes was tragically killed in August of 2014, but the legacy has gone on at the Mullet. I'd like to end right here with some famous graffiti that you may recognize in the city of Houston. At the very bottom, you see the Houston Food Truck Park, which is at St. Emmanuel Street, just outside of 59 in downtown. It's adjacent to the former Meridian Club, and it's opened as the grounds for the Houston Food Truck Park. So you'll see several food trucks parked here, and there's going to be block parties that go on. Artists come and paint here all the time, often painting their names, but also painting messages of inspiration. And at the very top is something I hope many of you have seen, driving on the Gulf Freeway southbound. In September 2012, 2 murals appeared on the train bridge on Gulf Freeway. Northbound, it says "Remove Hate," and that was done by the artist Remove. Southbound is this one that's been in the news recently because of all of its changes. Be Someone appeared, and although at a very prime location in the city of Houston officials have never removed either of these 2 murals. And they're so accessible to the public, you would have think that artists are coming here, painting here, the city knows about it, and yet the city is not painting over it. So many suspect it's because of the positive messages that are written right here, and so many Houstonians identify with these messages that the city has allowed these 2 murals to remain specifically. So it's up to each artist, each painter, and members of the community to maintain the purpose of graffiti. So I'd like to end by asking each of you a question, and that's, is graffiti simply visual blight, or is it a message of motivation, beauty, and social justice? Thank you.